This week, nearly 200 members of Congress signed a letter in support of the Hyde Amendment, which prohibits taxpayer funding of abortions. Each year since 1976, members of both parties, including former Senator Joe Biden, voted for appropriation bills that included the Hyde provisions. Now, during the 2020 campaign, Joe Biden reversed his long-standing support of Hyde, and Speaker Nancy Pelosi said in August she intended not to include the policy in the 2022 appropriation bills. Existing pro-life protections could also be at stake in the new Congress's COVID relief bill, which may not prohibit funding of abortions, abortion providers, and abortion coverage. We'll keep watching that. And Pope Francis commemorated Holocaust Remembrance Day at his weekly Wednesday audience from his private library at the Vatican. 76 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, remembering the genocide against Jews at the hands of the Nazis is an expression of humanity and a sign of civility. Speaking off the cuff at the end of his remarks, Francis also warned that another genocide could happen again. How? By following what he calls warped ideologies that claim to save a people and end up destroying a people and humanity. End quote. In recent weeks, there have been a tsunami of media coverage praising President Joe Biden's professed Catholicism. These pieces claim that Biden's agenda could save Catholicism in America and even Pope Francis's pontificate. Joining me to discuss this and much more is Editor-in-Chief of the Catholic Thing, Robert Royal. When I read this, Bob, I thought of you. I want to start with that New York Times piece from this weekend. It reads, Mr. Biden, perhaps the most religiously observant commander-in-chief in half a century, regularly attends Mass and speaks of how his Catholic faith grounds his life and his policies. And with Mr. Biden, a different, more liberal Christianity is ascendant, less focused on sexual politics and more on combating poverty, climate change, and racial inequity. Is Biden the most religiously observant commander-in-chief, Bob?
Well, to quote a previous president, it all depends what observant is. I would start out, just in general terms, Raymond, if we didn't know he was a Catholic, he didn't tell us he was a Catholic, what would we see in the way he is acting in office that would give us some sense that he's a Catholic in some distinctive sense? I don't see it, frankly. Mm-hmm. And when the New York Times talks about, less focused on sexuality and on these other issues, well, the left and the Democratic Party are the ones that are obsessed with sexuality. It's not just abortion, which I think is what the New York Times primarily.
I want to get to that, Bob. You make that good point, but stay on this one for a moment, though. Trying to cloak these policies and this presidency in this gauze of Catholicism, and it's one thing to speak about your faith, which look, I think I'm very pleased to hear people speak of their faith. The question is, does it then have any impact in the works that follow? Or is it just lip service and political, making use of the faith for political advantage?
Yeah, this quotation from the New York Times, where he's more focused on environment and poverty and immigration. This is always, it has been, it is, and it always will be a red herring. Because, look, I'm a conservative, and I care about the environment, I care about migrants, and I care about poor people, all of which I think are part of what it means to be a Catholic. I may differ with certain Democrats and even certain conservatives about what is the best path, and that's what politics is. It's trying to debate what are policies. But these things are not definitive of Catholicism. They are elements, of course, that exist in Catholicism. But the fullness of what the faith is something quite different. And what they're trying to do, of course, is to define or actually redefine Catholicism in a way that just will read out all those things that really challenge and oppose what are all too comfortable American and Western lifestyles are like. It's those things that are really the big challenge and are the most distinctive about Catholicism. And that's why I say that I don't see anything, if he believes that he's on a mission from God, that's good. And I'm glad that he goes to Mass every Sunday. But I don't see anything that I regard as distinctive in his Catholicism.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. What do you make of the depiction, and the piece tried to do this, that Biden is less focused on sexual politics? And as you mentioned, so far he's signed 2 executive orders in favor of progressive policies for transgender persons. He's going after the Mexico City policy, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And he stated that he would reinstate the contraceptive mandate and is planning to destroy the Hyde Amendment. It sounds like he's hyper-focused on sexual politics.
Yeah. And look, the people he's appointing, too, there's Javier Becerra, who was the Attorney General in California, who he's nominated to become Secretary of Health and Human Services. He has no experience dealing with things like the pandemic or running a department like that, but he does have experience in what I would call persecuting the Little Sisters of the Poor. I mean, the Little Sisters of the Poor do very good work with old people and with poor people. And why should they and any other religious body that objects to it have to be forced to pay for contraception? I mean, this is the defenders of the president's Catholicism say he is not trying to impose his Catholicism on others, on America, and that may be true, but he certainly isn't. He certainly is imposing this gender ideology and much else that lots of us object to and feel it is no place of the federal government to be directing us to follow. I mean, why should we be told by our federal government that we have to pay for abortions or contraception that goes against our consciences?
Bob, several other periodicals, America Magazine, The New Yorker, made comparisons this week between Biden and Pope Francis, echoing this idea that was spelled out in the New York Times. And they all picked up on this line of thinking. The New York Times writes, while conservative Catholics have doubled down on abortion policy and religious freedom for the past 4 years, Mr. Biden's priorities reflect those of Pope Francis, who has sought to turn the church's attention from sexual politics to issues like environmental protection, poverty, and migration. Now, Bob, while the Pope may advocate for immigration and the environment, which is perfectly within his purview, it is a complete distortion to suggest that the Pope has jettisoned Catholic morality or church doctrine a la Joe Biden. But I'm going to let the audience decide. This is the Pope on marriage. Okay? Listen.
The family is also threatened by growing efforts on the part of some to redefine the very institution of marriage by relativism, by the culture of the ephemeral, by a lack of openness to life.
And here he is on abortion, Bob. The Pope said, I ask this question, is it right to cancel a human life to solve a problem, any problem? No, that's not right. Rent a hitman to solve a problem, one that kills human life? This is the problem of abortion. And this is Pope Francis on gender theory. He said, a great enemy of marriage is gender theory. Today there's a global war out to destroy marriage, not with weapons, but with ideas. We have to defend ourselves from ideological colonization. Please don't say the Pope sanctifies transgenders. I want to be clear. It's a moral problem. It's a human problem, and it must be resolved always, can be, with the mercy of God, with the truth. He said that in Azerbaijan in 2016. Robert, how does any of that square with what Biden is proposing vis-a-vis gender or abortion, et cetera?
Yeah, I think that you're quite right to point to all these statements that the Pope has made. Now, the one place I think where there is some plausibility to the argument that the defenders of the president are bringing forward is that the Pope has not been as forceful in pursuing those culture, we can call them culture war elements, as he has other things. He hasn't written an encyclical on, for example, the environment. He wrote an encyclical on the environment, but he hasn't done one on, say, gender ideology, although other elements in the Vatican have published documents about it. He hasn't done, I mean, I think that abortion, anybody who's a clear thinker, you don't even have to be a Catholic. You just have to understand what is at stake, that innocent human life is being destroyed. That is the most clear way in which human life is being disrespected in our time. And I would urge anyone who's listening to this in Rome that it would help a great deal if the Pope would put greater emphasis on that. He can still pursue those other interests that he has. I mean, I'm interested in the environment. I'm interested in the way the family is going to be reconstructed. There are many other things, but this ideological redefinition of sexuality, this ignoring of the largest number, it's something like 60 million children are killed in the womb every year globally, not here in the United States, obviously. We only kill about 1 million. To me, if there were a war going on and 60 million people were dying there every year, we would all rightly be outraged. And I think that the Holy Father and the way he acts, speaks, and publishes should reflect the urgency and the size of that problem.
Yeah, but Bob, there's a misunderstanding, I think, in the media and maybe in the culture at large, that if the Pope says it or doesn't say it, that somehow changes Catholic doctrine or teaching. That is not the case. The Pope could fall mute tomorrow. Catholic doctrine remains what it is, and life will always be protected from conception to natural death. That's a priority for the Church, as the bishops have taught recently. What is the media trying to do here, Bob? Trying to wrap Biden in this faith. You remember Amy Coney Barrett was mocked for her Catholic faith. Now Biden is being celebrated. Is this a way to try to confuse the pious or an attempt to revive the so-called religious left? And is there a religious left to speak of at this time?
Well, there is. It's small, but it has access to outlets like the New York Times and major news media. That point of view gets transmitted through universities, often even Catholic universities. I'm sorry to say, and also through our popular culture. So look, it's there. It has an outsized voice, but I think that the mere fact of the matter is that the active Catholics, particularly here in the United States, we know that in the voting, Biden and Trump basically split the vote. It's hard to say within a few percentage points which way they're. What the outlets like the New York Times and others are trying to do is put their thumb on the scale a little bit and say, see, you can be a leader, probably the leader of the entire world, and still be a left-wing Catholic. Now, in places like Argentina, the Pope's own homeland, and places in Europe, Catholics have sort of made their peace with leaders who are pro-abortion. And I think in this case, we've seen already in what the Biden administration is doing that this is more than simply tolerating abortion. I think it's actually advancing and pushing it. They assume that this is a way to control poverty or to deal with other problems that arise from what are so-called unwanted pregnancies. But we here in the United States have never accepted that. We've had the Hyde Amendment, which says, okay, the compromise is there are all these people who are pro-abortion, but there's nothing we can do about that in the short run, although we're going to try to evangelize. So what do we do? Okay, it's legal to have an abortion, but we're not going to make people pay for this. You want it, you pay for it yourself. That, I think, we see is now being threatened. And obviously, the main parts of the mainstream culture want to see things move in that direction, even for the Church.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's unbelievable, the breathtaking speed of this. But look, I'm not at all disturbed by this, Bob. I knew this was coming during the campaign. We talked about some of these things. This is what Biden talked about. We knew who was behind this run. And it's the same people that were part of the Obama administration. So none of this is surprising. In a recent book on Biden and Catholicism, theologian, I use the term loosely, Massimo Fagioli writes, the fate of Biden's Catholicism in America is interwoven with the fate of Pope Francis's pontificate. That is its long-term fate, even after the next conclave. Both depend on what will become, in the United States, of Francis's proposal of an anti-ideological and anti-moralistic Catholicism. So let me get this straight, Bob. Biden will determine the outcome of the next conclave. What do you make of this?
Well, look, I read parts of that book. I haven't had time yet. It just came out to finish the whole thing. And look, he's a scholar, and for a foreigner, he understands a good bit about what's going on here in the United States. And I applaud him for that. I've spent a lot of time abroad, and it's very hard to understand a foreign culture. But what I don't think he gets right is the way he tries to read from a European perspective certain things that are happening here and apply them to the Holy Father. For example, he says at one point that the Jesuit order will be the global voice of Catholicism into the future. I mean, the Jesuit order is is plummeting, and just in terms of the number of Jesuits there are in the world. And I don't see how they're the global voice. I mean, Father Martin, of course, is a voice here. Father Spadaro in Rome, the Holy Father himself is a Jesuit, but I don't see that religious order defining much of anything. The other oddity, for a person who actually does have some insights into American Catholicism, is that he thinks that are generally more conservative than European bishops here in the United States are part of what he calls an intransigent neo-19th century Catholicism. Now, this is extremely odd. You know, America is quite a bit different from Europe. And the idea that say, a figure like Archbishop Chaput, who's very sophisticated, very pastoral, understands very well, you know, what's at stake, is somehow an intransigent from 2 centuries ago. This is ridiculousness. Now, the fact that Biden, as president, is a Catholic, is going to have an influence in the world. There's no question about that. But
I agree.
as you pointed out in those quotations, the Holy Father himself, even if it hasn't been noticed, has made some pretty strong statements against the kinds of things that President Biden and his administration are seeking to impose on the country right now. So to identify the two of these may be a pious wish on his part, but I don't know that even the Vatican is going to be all that flattered to hear that.
Well, the idea that you would identify a political leader and a broken down, you know, kind of guy who's been around the track many times as somehow the vehicle that will rescue and carry Pope Francis's pontificate forward in time is a real bad bet to my eye. I mean, look, John Paul II and Reagan worked together. They had a common enemy in atheistic communism. I don't see what the common enemy here is, unless you're talking about traditional people of faith or religious people, which is who Biden has identified as the enemy, clearly. I mean, he's called them domestic terrorists in some respects. And you touched on a point, Bob, and I want to delve into this in our remaining minutes. The bishops have already confronted Biden on what they term moral evils embedded in his policies. I'm talking about the U.S. bishops here. Bishop Gomez's statement last week. Does this entire project put the bishops in a bad spot?
Now, I would argue it puts them in a good spot because it enables them to say what is good in, you know, attempts to deal with people who've been marginalized and whatnot. And there should be a debate about how we go about handling those things, as I said earlier. But it also gives them a chance to put forward a strong voice about what's going on in Washington, D.C. Look, one of the things Fagioli points out quite rightly about the United States is that our, again, more conservative, although not uniformly conservative, bishops here in the United States resemble things more like the global South. In other words, if you want to find a set of bishops that are going to stand up to homosexuality and transgenderism, which they're going to regard as crazy, and abortion, it's going to be Africa, and it's going to be Asia, and it's going to be parts of Latin America, maybe not necessarily Argentina, where the Holy Father is from. And if that's the case, if it's the case that in America we resemble the global South more than the postmodern West, this really means to me that that part of the world that is growing in Catholicism, there are going to be more Catholics in sub-Saharan Africa in 2100 than there are in the entire world right now. So that's the growing and faithful part of Catholicism. To think that somehow this interim, and it's probably going to be 4 years of Joe Biden, is somehow the vehicle that is going to carry forward some other Catholicism, even just in the weight of those demographics, I think it's very much wide of the mark. And we will see as time goes on. Many people have said this about other denominations in Catholicism, that the more conservative of Christianity, the more conservative forms of Christianity are flourishing. The ones that are not faithful to the gospel are dropping away because they become one with the surrounding culture, which is not particularly Christian. So I think that the history of this is going to go in a quite different direction.
Bob, Archbishop Cordileone put out a statement last week after Speaker Nancy Pelosi accused pro-life Catholics who voted for Trump as selling the whole of democracy down the river for, quote, that one issue, abortion, end quote. The Archbishop wrote, Nancy Pelosi does not speak for the Catholic Church. She speaks as a high-level, important government leader and as a private citizen. And on the question of the equal dignity of human life in the womb, She also speaks in direct contradiction to the fundamental human right that Catholic teaching has consistently championed for 2,000 years. He said this on Shannon Bream's show.
My concern that she's misleading Catholics into thinking that they can be good Catholics and acceptable to favor abortion. But let's face it, abortion is just blatantly evil.
Bob, is this a predicate, this warning? Is this a predicate for a more serious warning for Nancy Pelosi, like a denial of the sacraments?
Well, I would hope that it was, but that is going to be the Rubicon, because it's easier to talk. It's not easy even to say what the Archbishop just said, and I think that was terrific what he just said. But it's easier to talk than actually to do something. My dear friend, the late Cardinal Francis George of Chicago, used to bring in the Illinois congressmen and senators and talk with them about how they were endangering their souls. But he wasn't willing to go that further step to I think he actually warned them not to come forward for communion, but they never observed. It would take something very serious, I think, to get our bishops to that point. They don't seem to want to take that step. But from what we've already seen, and it's just a few days of the Biden presidency, we've already seen them doing. And I hope I'm wrong about religious liberty, but I think that they're going to really put pressure on not only the Little Sisters, but hospitals and schools and universities and
Absolutely.
I mean, they're going to be going after all of these things, and we're all going to be required to pay for contraception and abortion. I think that if in a way, this could be a critical moment where our bishops, our good bishops, could step forward and say, this far and no farther. We're with you. Archbishop Gomez was born in Mexico. He's very pro taking care of the poor. I assume that he's concerned about the environment. But his statement, which was temporarily blocked, as we all know, for last week before the Vatican wanted to get a statement in first. I think his statement was terrific. And if I were him and somebody called me from Rome and said, you shouldn't do this, I would say, look, we're Americans. We understand our place, and we understand where our church should be here. This is not a matter of any doctrine. It's not a matter of discipline. We are talking to a Catholic as the shepherds who have been designated for the United States of America. This is an opportunity. It's going to be a tough time for our bishops and all of us lay people and Catholics. And I think for people who are resistant to the way that the culture has been going for a long time. But this is our moment. This is our moment to actually stand up and say something that might actually convert.
Bob, Cardinal Wilton Gregory in D.C. has said he will prefer dialogue with the new president rather than rescinding the sacraments or making threats of the sacraments against him. If that is the stance, what does communion really mean for the Catholic in the United States? Does it mean you don't have to be in communion with the church on belief, practice, public activities, etc.?
Well, look, I don't want to be flip about this, but if there's going to be dialogue, I think the first sentence that the cardinal ought to utter to Joe Biden is go to confession and make a firm resolution not to sin any longer. Because if you're going to be the president of the United States and simply adopt what your party has taken to be the cutting edge of where it's going to go over the next 4 years, and you're just going to ride roughshod, I think it. Look, I hope I'm wrong about this, but I think it's already clear just in these few days that any dialogue is going to take place on stuff that we already know we can talk about. We can debate about, what environmental policy or immigration policy ought to be.
Yeah.
It's those particular things that Catholics who are standing up for the natural law. Look, abortion is not about sex. Abortion is about violence. Abortion, of course, is the last line of defense of the sexual revolution, in that, if you get pregnant having done something, you can kill the baby through abortion. But it's not primarily about sex. We're talking about protecting innocent human life. And that would have to be the beginning of the dialogue. I have a feeling that in any so-called dialogue or negotiations or compromises that are going to be made will not really be in good faith. And I'm sorry to say that, because I think that it would be helpful if we could have some sort of rational conversations in the United States these days, but I don't see it happen.
Well, I think Cardinal Dolan was right when he said you can't support the death penalty for the unborn. You know, you can't be opposed to the death penalty and then support it for the unborn. And as Archbishop Cordileone mentioned the other day, I've never met anyone, he said, who's personally opposed to slavery but supports it. I mean, you know, this would be an outrageous concept if you articulated that, and yet that is exactly what these politicians are doing vis-a-vis abortion. We'll leave it there. Robert Royal, his commentary is at thecatholicthing.org. Bob's latest book, Columbus and the Crisis of the West, is available at bookstores everywhere. Thank you, Bob.
Okay, Raymond, see you.